She wasn't supposed to be there. She had nothing, no shoes, no home, no family. She slipped quietly through the gates of a mansion that glittered like a palace above the California coast, and seconds later, his paralyzed son moved. Cameras didn't catch what happened next, but every person who's heard this story still can't believe it's real. Her name was Alice, and the world had given her nothing, no home, no family, and no reason to dream. But that afternoon, as the sun poured gold over the marble steps, she saw a young boy sitting alone in a wheelchair, staring at the fountain's reflection like he was searching for someone he'd lost. His name was Brian Rice, the only child of billionaire Michael Rice, a man whose empire stretched from Silicon Valley's glass towers to the luxury hills of Los Angeles. Yet behind the manicured lawns and high-tech walls, his mansion had become a mausoleum of silence, haunted by grief, wealth, and a boy who no longer smiled. Brian hadn't laughed in nearly a year, not since the car crash that killed his mother and left him paralyzed from the waist down. He'd once been full of energy, the kind of kid who built Lego skyscrapers and raced his skateboard down the driveway, but after the accident, he shut down completely. Therapists came and went. Treatments failed. Even Michael's millions couldn't buy back the sound of his laughter. That was about to change. Alice took one look at the sad boy in the chair and, without thinking, began to dance. Not like the polished dancers in music videos, but with wild, fearless joy, spinning barefoot, waving her arms, pretending to trip just to make him smile. At first, Brian only blinked. Then, his lips twitched. And then, for the first time in months, he laughed a pure, unrestrained laugh that echoed through the courtyard. From the balcony above, Michael froze mid-step. He hadn't heard that sound since the night his wife died. And as he watched the little homeless girl dancing in his garden, sunlight glinting off her laughter, he realized something no amount of wealth had ever taught him, that sometimes the miracle we pray for walks in barefoot. What happened next would change all of their lives forever. But before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from and which part of the story hit you the hardest. I believe this story found you today for a reason. Now let's get back to the story. Her name was Alice Judes. Nobody in the neighborhood knew where she came from. Some said she danced at Venice Beach for coins. Others said she'd run away from a foster home downtown. But the truth, the real story, was far more heartbreaking and far more powerful than anyone could imagine. Before the world hardened around her, Alice used to dance with her mother in the narrow aisles of a roadside diner on Santa Monica Boulevard. Her mom, Dana, would close up after the evening rush, wipe down the counters, and play old records on a dusty jukebox. Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye. The two of them would twirl between the booths, laughing and spinning, their bare feet sliding on the black and white tiles. It was the kind of happiness you don't realize is precious until it's gone. But happiness, in Alice's world, didn't last long. Her father disappeared when she was 4, a construction worker who promised he'd come home after one last job. He never did. Her mother worked double shifts, holding everything together with little more than stubborn love and tired smiles. Then came the layoffs. Then the eviction notice. Then the night Dana packed their lives into 2 plastic bags and told Alice they'd have to start over somewhere new. Somewhere new turned out to be an overcrowded shelter downtown, where the air smelled like bleach and heartbreak. Dana kept saying it was temporary. But one morning, Alice woke up to find her mother gone, her cot empty, her blanket folded. A note sat on top, written in her mother's shaky hand. "I'm sorry, baby. I'll find us a better life. Be brave." She never came back. Alice bounced from one foster home to another, some kind, others cruel. She learned how to pack her things fast, how to stay invisible, how to run when hands turned mean. By the time she was 10, she stopped waiting for anyone to save her. The streets became her teacher, the noise, her lullaby, the world, her stage. She found refuge in movement, dancing for strangers, for herself, for survival. At first, it was just spinning on cracked sidewalks, pretending her mother's music still played somewhere nearby. But soon, it became her armor. When people ignored her, she danced harder. When they shouted, she smiled wider. Dancing was the only thing that made her feel seen. Most nights, she slept behind a shuttered ice cream shop near the Venice boardwalk. The hum of the ocean became her lullaby, and the glittering lights of the pier were her stars. Some days, kind tourists tossed her coins. Other days, she went hungry. But no matter what, she kept dancing, because if she stopped moving, the sadness would catch her. That afternoon at the rice estate, she hadn't planned to trespass. Alice had wandered farther than usual, following the sound of a distant fountain and the scent of roses drifting from beyond the wall. She'd been dancing on the sidewalk when she saw it, a stretch of white marble stairs and sunlight glinting off glass like water. A mansion that looked like heaven to a girl who'd known only pavement. She peeked through the gate and saw Brian, pale and still in his wheelchair. His face looked so lost, so lonely. It reminded her of herself the night her mom disappeared. Her stomach growled. She almost walked away, but something stopped her, maybe instinct, maybe memory. She slipped through the side gate, her heart pounding in her chest, and crept toward the boy. Then she began to dance. Not the kind of dance you learn in studios or see on TikTok, but the kind that comes from deep inside, messy, full of heart, bursting with freedom. Her feet kicked up dust, her arms swung wide, her braids flew behind her like ribbons. For a long moment, he just stared. Then, to her shock, he laughed, a small sound at first, then bigger, louder, pure. Alice froze, smiling through her own surprise. For one shining minute, the world made sense again. It didn't last. The sound of heavy footsteps shattered the calm. 2 security guards rushed from the side entrance, shouting, "Hey, you there! Stop!" Alice panicked, stumbling backward. She hadn't stolen anything, but she knew how the world saw kids like her. Dirty, desperate, dangerous. "Please! I wasn't taking nothing!" she cried, her small voice echoing off the marble walls. Behind them, Michael Rice appeared tall, dressed in a black suit, his expression sharp with anger. From the balcony, he'd watched the entire scene unfold. He'd seen the laughter, yes, but also the trespass, the breach of his carefully controlled world. "What is going on here?" he demanded, voice low and commanding. "How did she get in?" The guards hesitated, gripping Alice's arm gently but firmly. "She came through the side gate, sir. We caught her dancing near the boy." Michael's eyes flicked toward Brian, who was still smiling, a wide, beaming smile that looked foreign on his face. For a moment, it made Michael falter, but years of protecting his empire hardened his tone again. "This is private property," he snapped. "You have no right to be here." Alice's heart thudded in her chest. She looked from Michael's cold face to Brian's worried one. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "He just looked sad. I thought, if I danced, maybe he'd smile." Her voice trembled. Not from fear, but sincerity. "I wasn't stealing. I promise." Something in the way she said it, small, honest, without begging, pierced through Michael's anger. For a second, he saw her differently, not as a threat, but as a child trying to survive. But the businessman in him was louder. The need to protect, to control, to fix. "Take her out," he said curtly, "and make sure the gates stay locked." Brian's face fell instantly. "Dad, wait!" he began, but the guards were already leading Alice toward the exit. She didn't fight. She just turned once and smiled at Brian. Keep laughing, okay? She whispered. Then she was gone. That evening, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. Michael sat in his study, staring at his glass of bourbon. The ocean view stretched beyond his window, but it gave him no peace. He kept hearing the echoes, Brian's laughter, Alice's voice, the sound of bare feet on marble. For months, he'd begged doctors to bring joy back into his son's life. And now, a homeless child had done it in less than 5 minutes. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a shaky sigh. His logical mind screamed that it was absurd, that it was a coincidence, a fluke of timing. But deep inside, another part of him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he'd witnessed something real. He walked to Brian's room. The door was slightly open. Inside, the boy was awake, staring at the ceiling with a faint smile on his face. Michael leaned against the door frame. "You should be asleep," he said softly. Brian turned his head. "I can't stop thinking about her," he murmured. "The girl who danced." Michael felt something stir inside him, a mix of protectiveness and guilt. "She shouldn't have been here," he said. "It was dangerous." She broke in. "She didn't hurt anyone," Brian whispered. "She made me laugh." Michael had no answer. He nodded stiffly, muttered good night, and closed the door, but he didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Meanwhile, under the cold glow of the Venice boardwalk lights, Alice curled up behind a souvenir shop. The laughter from earlier replayed in her head, the sound of the boy's joy, so pure it made her chest ache. She smiled into the dark. For once, she hadn't danced for coins or pity. She danced because it mattered, because someone had needed it. Her stomach rumbled, but she didn't mind. For the first time in years, she felt full of purpose. She thought about the man's face, stern, proud, angry. She knew that kind of look. Adults had been looking at her like that all her life. But the boy's eyes, those she couldn't forget. He'd looked at her like she was magic. When morning sunlight spilled through the glass walls of the Rice mansion, Michael found Brian already awake, sitting near the window, his eyes on the garden below. "Morning," Michael said quietly, setting a tray of breakfast down. Brian didn't respond right away. He was deep in thought, tapping his fingers against the armrest, a new habit Michael hadn't seen before. Finally, Brian turned to him. "Dad," he said slowly, voice raspy from disuse. "Can the dancing girl come back?" Michael froze. It was the first full sentence Brian had spoken in months. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately, to do anything that kept that spark alive. But another part hesitated, afraid of blurring boundaries between his world and hers. "She's just a kid from the street," Michael said gently. "It's not that simple." Brian's eyes filled with quiet determination. "It is, to me." Later that day, Michael stood on the balcony, watching the sun rise over the Pacific. The city below shimmered his city, his empire, a life built on control, precision, and success. But all he could think about was a barefoot girl who had danced her way through those walls like sunlight through glass. His phone buzzed, his assistant reminding him of a board meeting. He ignored it. Instead, he looked down at the courtyard, where the memory of laughter still seemed to linger in the air. For the first time in years, he wondered what his late wife would have said if she were here. She would have smiled, he realized. She would have told him not to chase the girl away. Laura had always believed that kindness could fix things, money never could. He exhaled slowly. Maybe it was time he believed that too. Across the city, Alice was back on the boardwalk, spinning for strangers. Her bare feet slapped against the pavement as she twirled to the rhythm of a street musician's guitar. Coins clinked into her cup a little more than usual. But her mind wasn't on the money. It was on the boy with the sad eyes who had laughed. She wondered if he remembered her, if he was still smiling, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she whispered into the sea breeze, I hope so. That night, Michael made a decision he couldn't quite explain. He called his head of security and said, "Find that girl." The guard hesitated. "Sir, the one from yesterday," Michael said firmly. "Alice, I want to talk to her." As he hung up, he didn't know why his heart was pounding so fast. Maybe guilt, maybe hope. All he knew was that for the first time in a long while, he was listening to something other than fear. Maybe, just maybe, he was listening to his heart. The next afternoon, Michael did something even he didn't understand. He sent his driver downtown with simple instructions: find the girl and bring her here. When Alice stepped out of the car and onto the marble driveway, she froze. The mansion looked even larger in daylight, its walls gleaming like something from a dream she didn't belong in. She clutched her worn backpack, eyes darting between the guards and the open doorway. Inside, the air smelled faintly of citrus and polished wood. A maid smiled gently and guided her toward the kitchen. "You hungry, sweetheart?" she asked. Alice nodded hesitantly. She was offered a plate of food, grilled chicken, fresh bread, and a glass of milk. At first, she only stared at it. Then she took a tiny bite, careful, almost apologetic. Every chew seemed to make her smaller, as if she feared someone would change their mind and take it away. Michael watched from the doorway, arms folded. Something about the way she whispered "thank you" after every bite made his chest tighten. The staff, usually stiff and silent, softened. Someone even slipped her an extra roll for later. When the meal was done, Michael led her out to the garden where Brian waited in his wheelchair, eyes bright with anticipation. The boy's face lit up the moment he saw her. "You came back," he said. Alice smiled, brushing her braids from her face. "I said I would make you laugh again, didn't I?" She stepped onto the grass and began to dance, clumsy, silly, full of heart. She spun in circles, crossed her eyes, and pretended to trip over invisible wires. Brian's laughter came instantly loud, wild, unstoppable. It echoed off the marble walls, filling every corner of the once silent mansion. Even Michael couldn't help it. A small, reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. By the third day, laughter had become part of the house again. Brian clapped along, sometimes trying to copy Alice's movements with his upper body. He lifted his hands higher, moved his shoulders, even leaned forward slightly when she twirled too close. Each attempt brought cheers from the staff, who found excuses to linger nearby just to watch. At one point, Brian's physical therapist arrived for a scheduled session. He paused, amazed, as Brian lifted both arms to mimic Alice's spin. "Whatever you're doing," the therapist said, grinning, "keep doing it." That night, after the house had gone quiet, Michael stood on the balcony overlooking the Pacific. The ocean shimmered silver under the moonlight. From below, faint echoes of laughter still drifted up through the open windows, his son's laughter. For months, he had chased cures across continents, writing checks that bought nothing but disappointment. And yet a barefoot girl had brought back hope simply by dancing. He exhaled, the corners of his lips softening. "Maybe," he whispered to the wind, "she's the medicine money couldn't buy." Inside, the mansion no longer felt like a tomb. It breathed again, alive with warmth, light, and the rhythm of laughter returning home. The weeks that followed felt almost like a miracle. Every afternoon, the sound of laughter drifted across the Rice Mansion, music so new and strange that even the staff began timing their chores around it, just to catch a glimpse. Alice came faithfully, always barefoot, always smiling. She'd arrive with a shy wave and a quick, "Hi, Mr. Rice," then head straight for the garden where Brian waited by the fountain. Their friendship grew as naturally as sunlight over the roses. He called her his lucky charm. She called him her favorite audience. For the first time in years, the mansion felt alive. Yet not everyone saw it that way. Whispers began to curl through the hallways like smoke. The housekeeper worried that a girl from the streets might bring trouble. The driver muttered that people were talking. Even the neighbors had begun asking questions. And soon, word reached Michael's business circle. At a dinner downtown, his partner, David Sloan, leaned close and said quietly, "Mike, you've always had a good heart, but this thing with the homeless girl? It's all over the gossip sites. Investors are calling it reckless." Michael's jaw tightened. "She's a child! David!" "She made my son laugh again." "Sure, but the optics," David pressed. "Reporters love a scandal. One headline about a billionaire housing a street girl, well, you know how that plays." The words stung more than Michael wanted to admit. Reputation had always been his armor, his proof of control. But when he looked across the table and saw his reflection in the restaurant's glass wall, he barely recognized the man staring back, cold, polished, untouchable. The next morning, his PR agent called. "Michael, darling, I have an idea. We'll sponsor the girl, send her to a nice shelter downtown. Maybe start a little foundation in her name. It'll look generous and get everyone off your back." Michael didn't answer. He just looked out the window at the ocean, his mind heavy. Unbeknownst to him, Alice had been standing outside the study door. She heard every word. That afternoon, when she came to see Brian, her eyes were red, her usual spark dimmed. She knelt beside him and said softly, "I think maybe I should go." Brian frowned. "What? Why?" "I don't want to cause trouble," she whispered. Michael appeared in the doorway just as Brian's face crumpled. "You can't leave," the boy said, voice trembling. "Please, Dad, tell her she can't leave." Michael's throat tightened. For a moment, pride and fear wrestled inside him, the instinct to protect his image, to stay safe behind the walls of status. Then he looked at his son, eyes wet, hands shaking, and something inside him cracked open. "Stop," he said quietly. Alice turned, startled. Michael stepped forward, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "You stay," he said, "as long as he needs you." For a second, no one moved. Then Brian smiled through his tears, and Alice's shoulders relaxed in relief. Outside, the sun dipped low over the Pacific, spilling warm light across the garden. And though the whispers beyond the mansion walls would continue, inside, a new truth began to take root, one stronger than fear, richer than pride. Compassion had found its place in a house once ruled by silence. The days began to fall into a gentle rhythm, one that no therapist, no medicine, and no amount of money had ever been able to create. Every afternoon, when the sun dipped behind the palms and the garden filled with golden light, Alice and Brian would claim their little patch of grass near the fountain. There, laughter became routine. Alice had started teaching Brian tiny dance routines. Nothing fancy, just hand movements, shoulder rolls, small upper body sways that made him feel like he was part of her rhythm. Sometimes she played songs on her old cracked phone, the speaker fuzzy but full of life. Other times she just clapped a beat, humming whatever tune popped into her head. "Left, right, spin," she'd say, and Brian would laugh so hard he'd lose the beat. "You're terrible at this," she teased one day, sticking out her tongue. "Hey, I'm improving," he shot back, twisting his shoulders. "You're just jealous I have better rhythm sitting down." Michael, watching from the balcony above, couldn't help but chuckle quietly to himself. It had been months since he'd heard Brian joke. Soon, the two of them started filming short TikToks on Alice's phone. Silly skits, dance duets, even one where Brian played the serious director while Alice performed exaggerated ballet moves. They posted under a shared account called At the Wheel and the Wings. Within a week, a few clips went viral, people across the internet leaving comments like, "This made my day," and "That boy's laugh could heal the world." But for Michael, it wasn't about the views. It was about watching his son come alive again. He started joining them outside, sitting at the edge of the patio with a cup of coffee, pretending to read emails but secretly just listening. Every time Brian laughed, something in him loosened. He began clapping when Brian got a move right, cheering when Alice made him giggle uncontrollably. One evening, Alice pointed her phone toward Michael and said, "You should join our next video." He laughed, actually laughed, and shook his head. "No one needs to see that. Come on," Brian said, grinning. "We'll make you go viral, old man." "Old man?" Michael raised an eyebrow, pretending to be offended. But later that night, when he caught his reflection in the glass doors, he noticed something strange. He was smiling. The grief that had once clung to him like a shadow seemed, for a moment, to ease. It was late one night when Alice found him in his office, still awake, papers scattered across his desk. The ocean wind drifted through the open window, carrying the faint sound of waves. "You work a lot," she said softly, stepping inside. Michael looked up from his laptop. "Comes with the job, I guess." She hesitated, then asked, "Why do rich people always look so sad?" The question hung in the air like a whisper in a cathedral. Michael blinked, caught off guard. He searched for a quick answer, something polished, adult, but found none. "I don't know," he admitted finally, voice quiet. "Maybe because we forget what actually matters." Alice tilted her head, smiling gently. "Well, I think what matters is laughing, dancing, being with people who don't make you feel alone." Michael swallowed hard. Her words were simple, but they hit deep, cutting through years of guilt, noise, and silence. When she left the room, the sound of her light footsteps faded down the hall, leaving him alone with a truth he couldn't ignore. He had spent his life building walls of glass and steel, but somehow a homeless girl with a dance and a smile had started planting seeds in the cracks, and for the first time in years, something inside him was beginning to grow again. It was the kind of afternoon that seemed to stand still, the sky a clear, endless blue, the sunlight soft and golden as it poured over the Rice mansion. The garden shimmered with color. The sound of the ocean drifted faintly through the palms. Alice was in her element. Barefoot, hair flying, she twirled and laughed as she moved to the rhythm of a song only she could hear. Her dance wasn't perfect, it was wild and free, full of small hops, quick spins, and the kind of joy that comes from being completely unafraid to look silly. Brian sat nearby, clapping along, his laughter rising above the music. His eyes followed every move, full of the kind of light Michael hadn't seen since before the accident. Alice leapt, spun again, then landed in a playful bow that made him burst out laughing. "You're going to get dizzy," he said, between giggles. "Dizzy is just another word for happy," she shouted back, spinning again. Michael was standing on the patio, pretending to read emails on his phone, but really watching them both, his son glowing with life, the homeless girl who had somehow become part of their world. For weeks, he'd been afraid this fragile joy might vanish as quickly as it came. But that day, the laughter felt different, deeper, real, alive. Then it happened. Alice stopped spinning, caught her breath, and said teasingly, "Your turn, Brian." He grinned. "In your dreams. Come on. Everyone can dance somehow," she said. "Even you." He shook his head, still laughing, but his hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. "I can't," he said softly. "You know that. You can try," she said, her tone gentle but sure. "Just a little." Something flickered in his eyes, a spark of determination, small but fierce. And then, to everyone's astonishment, he did try. He pressed down on the handles, his arms trembling with effort. His shoulders rose, then his back straightened. Michael's breath caught as Brian's body lifted just a few inches, but enough to make the world stop. "Alice," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I can feel my legs." Alice froze mid-step, her eyes wide. "What?" "I can feel them," he repeated, tears spilling down his cheeks. "They're tingling." The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the ocean quieted, as if listening. Michael dropped his phone and rushed forward, his heart pounding. For months he had watched his son grow smaller, sadder, weaker. Now, before his eyes, Brian was rising. He fell to his knees beside the chair, overcome, hands trembling as he steadied his son. "Brian," he whispered, voice breaking. "You did it." Brian let out a shaky laugh, part sob, part disbelief. Alice clapped her hands, tears streaming down her face. "You did it! You're amazing!" Michael pulled them both into an embrace, the boy he'd nearly lost, the girl who'd brought him back. For a moment, they simply held on to each other, laughing and crying all at once. The sunlight spilled over them, warm and golden, wrapping the three of them in quiet wonder. For the first time since Laura's death, the mansion wasn't a house filled with memories of loss. It was a home again, a place where laughter, hope, and healing danced together under the open sky. The days after Brian's first movement felt like a dream. Hope hummed through every hallway of the Rice mansion. Therapists came and went, astonished at the boy's sudden progress. But Michael knew deep down that medicine alone wasn't responsible. It was Alice. The girl with the tattered shoes and the fearless laughter, the one who had somehow become the heartbeat of their home. She came every day, not as a guest anymore, but as part of the family. She helped Brian with therapy, shared meals with the staff, even teased Michael when he tried to help her carry things. "You're the boss," she'd say with a grin. "Bosses aren't supposed to get their hands dirty." He'd laugh, but her words always stuck a little too deeply. Then, one quiet afternoon, while Brian was resting, Alice sat on the garden steps, backpack clutched to her chest. Her expression was distant, her smile smaller than usual. Michael noticed immediately. "You okay, Alice?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." He sat beside her. "About what?" Her fingers fidgeted with the frayed zipper of her backpack. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a small voice, she said, "About my dad." Michael froze. She had never mentioned him before. "He used to work construction," she continued. "He said he built the kind of buildings people only dream about living in. Tall ones, with glass that shines like water." Her voice trembled slightly. "One day, he went to work and never came home." Michael's chest tightened. "What happened?" Alice swallowed. "There was an accident. The scaffolding collapsed. My mom said the company never even called. No one gave us anything. She tried to fight it, but nobody listened. She said the company's name was Rice Development." The words hit like a physical blow. Michael's breath caught. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, aged, worn at the edges. She handed it to him. He unfolded it with shaking hands. At the top, in faded print, were the words Rice Development, Inc., followed by a list of incident details, dates, and one name under deceased, Thomas Judes. Michael's world seemed to tilt. The air left his lungs. He looked at Alice, this bright, brave child who had given his son back his laughter, and realized she was the daughter of a man his empire had failed, a man whose death had been buried beneath numbers, contracts, and silence. He whispered her father's name again and again, as if saying it could undo the years between them. "I'm so sorry," he said finally, his voice breaking. "Alice, I didn't know." She shook her head gently. "It's okay. I don't blame you. I just thought you should know." But Michael couldn't breathe past the guilt that clawed at his chest. Every skyscraper, every polished tower suddenly felt like a monument built on someone else's suffering. That night, he didn't sleep. He wandered through the dark hallways, the house quiet except for the hum of the ocean outside. He stopped in his office, staring at the framed photos of ribbon cuttings and groundbreaking ceremonies. His name, his face, his empire, all symbols of success, but now they felt like ghosts of every person he'd stepped over to get here. He sank into his chair, covering his face with his hands. "God," he whispered hoarsely, "what kind of man have I been?" The question hung heavy in the still air, unanswered but necessary. For the first time, Michael Rice, the man who'd built an empire, felt small, and in that moment of humility, repentance began to grow, soft and fragile, like a seed breaking through the cracks of stone. The morning after Michael's confession hung heavy with silence. The sky outside was gray, the ocean restless, and Michael moved through the mansion as if every polished floor and framed photo whispered his guilt back at him. He couldn't stop replaying Alice's words, Rice development. My father. No one ever called. But when Alice arrived later that day, she wasn't angry. She walked into the study, her backpack slung over her shoulder, and found Michael staring out the window. "You heard," she said softly. He turned, eyes red. "Alice, I don't even know where to begin. I can't undo what happened to your father. I built this life thinking I'd earned it. But She stopped him with a gentle shake of her head. "You don't have to say anything." He frowned. "But I do. I owe you." "No," she interrupted. Her voice was quiet but steady. "You can't change the past, Mr. Rice, but you can change me, and you already did." Michael's throat tightened. She smiled, small and sure. "You gave me a place to belong, and you gave Brian his life back. That's more than enough." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she tilted her head toward the garden. "He's waiting," she said, a hint of her usual playfulness returning. "You know he gets grumpy if I'm late." The air outside was warm, scented with roses and sunlight. Brian sat in his wheelchair, grinning the moment Alice appeared. "Took you long enough," he teased. She rolled her eyes. "Patience, superstar." They began their usual therapy routine, music playing softly from Alice's phone, slow movements, laughter between breaths. Michael sat nearby with his coffee, pretending to read reports but watching every second, as he always did. Halfway through the session, Brian suddenly shouted, "Alice, play that song!" She blinked, confused. "Which one?" "The one you danced to the first day I laughed," he said. His voice carried an electric kind of excitement, a determination that made her smile. She found the song, the scratchy, upbeat tune she'd spun to under that first golden afternoon, and pressed play. The rhythm filled the garden, bright and familiar. "All right," she said, stepping back. "Show me what you've got." Brian gripped the arms of his chair. His shoulders tensed, his breathing quickened. Then, slowly, painfully, he pushed down. His upper body lifted. His knees trembled. Alice froze, hands covering her mouth. "Brian," Michael whispered, standing. But Brian didn't stop. Inch by inch, he rose higher, until trembling, unsteady, but standing, he looked up through tears and laughed. "Dad!" he shouted, voice breaking. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Then chaos, joyful, disbelieving chaos. The housekeeper screamed. The guards ran from their posts. Michael dropped his coffee, spilling it across the stones. He ran to his son, falling to his knees beside him. "Brian," he breathed, his voice shaking. "You're standing." "I told you I could," Brian said, laughing and crying all at once. Michael pulled him close, holding him as if afraid to let go. Alice stood nearby, tears streaming down her face, the music still playing softly behind them. The mansion erupted in applause from the staff, from the therapists, from anyone who'd ever seen that boy's struggle. In that moment, under the California sun, the walls that once held grief now held victory, pain, faith, love, and redemption, all of it collided in one breathtaking miracle. And for the first time in years, Michael whispered a thank you, not to wealth or power, but to the two people who had reminded him what life was truly worth. News of the miracle spread faster than Michael could have imagined. Within days, clips of Brian standing shaky but grinning beside Alice were everywhere. The internet called it the billionaire and the street dancer. Some people wept watching it. Others called it fake, a PR stunt, another rich man's performance. Talk shows debated the story endlessly. Was it luck, science, or divine intervention? But for Michael, none of it mattered. He knew the truth. He'd seen it with his own eyes, the laughter, the light, the impossible becoming real. When reporters camped outside the mansion gates, Michael refused interviews. "This isn't a headline," he told his assistant. "It's our life." Inside, the world continued quietly, beautifully. Alice still came to the garden every day, though now she arrived through the front door, not the gate she once slipped through. She had new clothes, new shoes, and a new backpack filled not with old papers, but schoolbooks. Michael had made it official. He adopted her. The papers were signed in his lawyer's office, but what mattered most was the moment afterward when Alice looked up at him, voice trembling, and asked, "Does that mean I really belong here?" Michael knelt, taking her hands. "You always did," he said. Brian cheered so loud the secretary outside jumped. Months passed, and Michael turned his guilt into purpose. He launched the Thomas Jude's Foundation, named after Alice's father, a program dedicated to helping homeless and foster children find shelter, education, and hope. Every check he wrote, every speech he gave, felt like a quiet apology to the man he'd never met but could finally honor. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, reporters asked what inspired him. Michael's answer was simple: a little girl who danced when the world stopped watching. Life at the mansion changed in ways no one could have predicted. The halls that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter and music. Alice and Brian still filmed silly videos, but now they were joined by Michael, awkwardly dancing in the background while pretending not to smile. Brian's recovery amazed everyone. He could now walk short distances without assistance. Each step was slow, careful, but full of triumph. Every time he stumbled, Alice would grab his hand and say, "You fall, you dance, and then you try again." One bright morning, nearly a year after the day she first slipped through the gate, Brian and Alice walked together into the garden. The air smelled of roses and ocean salt. The sunlight spilled across the fountain, the exact place where their story began. Michael stood by the balcony, watching them. He didn't call out. He just let the sight wash over him, the boy who could now walk, the girl who had taught him how to live again. Brian turned and waved, smiling proudly. Alice laughed, spinning in the sunlight, her bare feet brushing against the grass. For a long time, Michael just stood there, his chest full, his heart quiet. Then he whispered the words that had become his truth. Some miracles are not found in hospitals or boardrooms. Sometimes they walk barefoot through the gates of your heart. And in that moment, he knew family wasn't built by blood or wealth or even fate. It was built by love, by grace, and by the courage to open your door when hope came knocking. If you love this story, please don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from and which part of the story hit you the hardest. We've got more powerful, emotional stories coming your way, and trust me, you don't want to miss them.